What is the divine counsel? Now, this is a term that might be unfamiliar to many. It's going to be familiar to others because the term actually comes from the Bible. It comes from Psalm 82, specifically in verse 1, where we read, God has taken his place in the divine counsel. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. If you go down a little ways to verse 6, you get some more information. God is speaking and he says to his counsel, I said, you are gods, sons of the Most High, all of you. Now, with both these verses, there's a little more to them than meets the eye, especially if you're working in English translations. If we go back to Psalm 82, verse 1, we notice that while the translation is good enough, I mean, it's pretty straightforward. God has taken his place in the divine counsel, first part of the line. But we notice that the word for God in Hebrew is Elohim. That's no big deal, again, because we're used to that. Elohim is one of the most common words for God in the Hebrew Bible, the Hebrew Old Testament. But what might be a surprise is that in the second half of the verse, we have, in the midst of the gods, he, God, holds judgment. The second occurrence of Elohim is translated gods. So here you have Elohim occurring two times in one passage, two times in one verse. The first time it is translated singularly, properly, because of the grammar. God takes his place in the divine counsel. And in the second part of the verse, it's translated properly, plural, because of the preposition in the midst of. It can't be in the midst of one entity. And so we have plural. God has taken his place in the divine counsel. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. If we take a little closer look at verse 6, where God is the speaker and he says to the members of his council, I said, you are gods. There we go again. We see the same word, Elohim. And that's put in parallel to another term, sons of the Most High, the B'nai Elyon. Now this is one of those terms that you'll see in the Hebrew Bible, the Hebrew Old Testament, for what might loosely be called angelic beings, other divine beings who are part of the heavenly host. In many cases, many passages, those beings are referred to as the sons of God, the B'nai Elohim, or the B'nai Ha-Elohim, or the B'nai Elim. Here we have B'nai Elyon, sons of the Most High. We know who the Most High is. It's God. So this is a synonymous expression for sons of God, which again is frequently used for divine beings, plural, in the Hebrew Bible. Now there are other passages that talk about a divine counsel. Passages like Psalm 89. And there we read, let the heavens praise your wonders, O Lord, your faithfulness in the assembly of the holy ones. For who in the skies can be compared to the Lord? Who among the heavenly beings is like the Lord? A God greatly to be feared in the council of the holy ones, and awesome above all who are around him. Again, there's a little bit more to look at here in this verse as well, specifically in Psalm 89, verse 6. Now, we again can read very straightforward in English, makes good sense, for who in the skies can compare to the Lord, can be compared. And then the next line is, who among the heavenly beings is like the Lord? We'll notice again, heavenly beings is very obviously one of those stock expression for divine, as in plural, divine beings who work with God, who are part of the heavenly host, who are part of the divine council. Who among the heavenly beings, the Hebrew is B'nai Elim, who among the sons of God is like the Lord? Of course, the rhetorical response, the rhetorical answer would be nobody. Now, another passage is 1 Kings 22, specifically verses 19 through 23. But if you're not familiar with the backstory of this passage, in this passage, in this chapter, the wicked king of Israel, Ahab, is trying to convince Jehoshaphat to go with him to a battle. And Jehoshaphat would like a word from the Lord. Should I go or should I not? And so finally, after listening to the prophets of Ahab, again, the prophets of Baal, essentially, Jehoshaphat says, hey, isn't there a prophet of Yahweh around here? And they summon Micaiah, and Ahab says in the passage, I hate this guy because he never tells me what I want to hear. But nevertheless, Micaiah shows up, and this is what we read in verse 19. Micaiah said, therefore, hear the word of the Lord. I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, and all the host of heaven standing beside him on his right hand and on his left. And the Lord said, who will entice Ahab that he may go up and fall at Ramoth Gilead? And one said one thing, and another said another. Well, who are these guys? Then a spirit came forward and stood before the Lord, saying, I will entice him. And the Lord said to him, by what means? And he said, I will go out and I'll be a lying spirit in the mouth of all his prophets. And he, God, said, you are to entice him and you shall succeed. So what we have in 1 Kings 22 is a divine council meeting. We get a glimpse sort of behind the veil as to what's going on in heaven. Now, God has decreed that it's time for Ahab to die. But what we see in 1 Kings 22 is he allows the members of his council, the members of the divine council, to participate in how that decree will be carried out. And you'll notice in the passage that these are not idols. These are not men. The members of the heavenly host, the members of God's council, are spirits. Because verse 21 said a spirit came forward and had a suggestion. So we're not dealing with, something really, really weird, like humans reigning with God in the sky. We're dealing with the heavenly host. We're dealing with the divine council. A council that Psalm 82 says are composed of plural Elohim. Another passage is Daniel 7. Now, we're familiar with this one because it's the famous Son of Man passage in the Old Testament that gets referenced and applied to Jesus when he's on trial before Caiaphas. But if you'll notice in this passage, we read something interesting in verse 9. Here, Daniel 7, verse 9. Daniel says, as I looked, thrones, plural, were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool, and his throne was fiery flames. Now we know who this is. This is God. The fiery throne with the wheels, Daniel goes on to describe. It's the same description as we get in Ezekiel 1, where God is on the throne in Ezekiel's vision. This is God seated, but there are thrones, plural. And we know that it's not just two. The Son of Man isn't seated, because the Son of Man will come to the Ancient of Days and then receive everlasting dominion. Later in the passage, we actually read that the court sat and, again, helped God to render judgment. So the divine council, again, participates in what's going on with God's decrees. So that's a brief overview of what in the world is this thing called the divine council. Again, in more familiar language, it's the heavenly host. But we need to pay attention to what's going on in Psalm 82:1, where the academic term really comes from. Psalm 82, verse 1, God, Elohim, takes his place in the divine council, and in the midst of the gods, in the midst of the Elohim, plural, he passes judgment, he renders judgment. Now, that raises all sorts of questions in the minds of a lot of people, so next time we get together, we're going to ask this question and, of course, answer it. Are the gods, the Elohim of the divine council, just humans? Now, I've already alluded to where I'm at on that question. The answer is going to be no. But you would be amazed at how many times you will read that in commentaries, especially New Testament commentaries when you get to John 10, because Jesus quotes Psalm 82 in one of those scenes in John 10. And every commentary on the Gospel of John I have ever seen, and I've seen a lot of them, says that the gods of Psalm 82 they're just people. They're just people. They might give you the other views, but they're just people. Nothing to see here, citizens. Nothing unusual going on. Well, that just isn't the case. Now, Psalm 89, if you recall our first lesson, answers this question because if you recall that verse, we have a reference to the divine council being in the skies, in the heavenlies, in the heavens, as it were. Let the heavens praise your wonders, O Lord, your faithfulness in the assembly of the holy ones. And that phrasing is going to become important in our lesson today, the assembly of the holy ones. For who in the skies can be compared to the Lord? Who among the heavenly beings, and that is the B'nai Elim, the sons of God, as we saw last time, who among the heavenly beings is like the Lord, a God greatly to be feared in the council of the holy ones, and awesome above all those who are around him. So in Psalm 82 we had gods. I said you are gods, Psalm 82 verse 6. Sons of the Most High, all of you. And these were the gods in Psalm 82 verse 1, where we have Elohim, Nitzav Ba'adat El. God takes his stand or takes his place in the divine council, and then Bekerev Elohim, in the midst of the Elohim, in the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. And those are the gods that are called sons of the Most High, 5 verses later. And here in Psalm 89, we have the assembly, the council of the holy ones, the council of the sons of God in the skies. So you might ask, well, how in the world could anybody even entertain the question that the gods, the Elohim, the plural Elohim of Psalm 82, are just men? Well, that's what we want to talk about today. The idea actually comes from a couple of places. One would be Exodus 18. Now, this is the passage, if you recall, where Moses is judging the people. Again, this is after the Exodus. They're on their way. They're ready to get the law at Sinai. And Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, comes out and sees basically how Moses is spending his days. All of the people lining up, coming to him for questions. And he says, look, this isn't a good idea. Why don't you appoint judges? Appoint people to help you out here. And we get that story. We get the record of what Moses does in Exodus 18. And believe it or not, people take this passage and say, look, these judges that Moses appointed are the Elohim of Psalm 82. And you think, well, again, how in the world could you get there? Well, part of the answer is you get there because you need to get there, because there are lots of people who want to deny divine plurality in Psalm 82. But if we actually go look at Exodus 18, we go to the passage, and what I've done on your screen is I've used something called a visual filter in my software, Logos Bible software. And I'll show you the filter. What it does is I've set it to colorize every occurrence of the word Elohim. Now I'm going to start scrolling through Exodus 18, and wherever you see the word God or gods colorized, that's going to be the word Elohim. Now, you'll notice that we have one plural instance of Elohim, translated gods in the ESV, and that's a reference to the pagan gods, the gods of the nations that the Israelites were not supposed to worship. So obviously those gods weren't appointed to be judges of Israel. But you'll notice something. Everywhere else in Exodus 18 that you see the word Elohim, two things. One, it could very easily just be translated God, a reference to the God of Israel. And the word is never linked to the judges. It's never actually linked to the people who are helping Moses render judgment. So this idea that Exodus 18, the appointing of judges, somehow allows us to call the Elohim of Psalm 82 men, again, just really doesn't work when you actually go look at the passage. There's no reason to read Exodus 18 that way at all. Now, that isn't the only sort of attempted proof for the idea that the Elohim of Psalm 82 are just men. We could go to Exodus 22, verses 8 and 9, and there's something interesting going on there, sort of underneath the hood of your English translation. Let's take a look at the passage. This is the account where there's a judicial setting, a judicial case. It's about thievery against some laws and punishments, that kind of idea. And we read here starting in verse 8, "If the thief is not found, the owner of the house shall come near to God to show whether or not he has put his hand to his neighbor's property. For every breach of trust, whether it is for an ox, for a donkey, for a sheep, for a cloak, or for any kind of lost thing, of which one says, 'This is it,' the case of both parties shall come before God. The one whom God condemns shall pay double to his neighbor." Now, there are those who would say, look, it doesn't make any sense, to bring these little judicial cases before God. Surely, God there must be translated, plural, Elohim. Bring him before the gods, meaning the Israelite judges. Of course, the passage never actually says that. You have to read that into the passage. But as the ESV points out, it's very easy just to have capital G-O-D here anyway, because the idea might be, okay, bring the thief near to sacred space or the place of the sanctuary, again, sort of holy ground where God, lives, because you see this happen in other places in the Torah, in the Pentateuch, where people are brought by Moses or Joshua or whoever, and they all gather together like at the entrance of the tabernacle, and it actually says, Lifnei Adonai, before the Lord or before God. So that could be quite easily what's going on here. We don't have to read into the passage the idea that we have judges here and the judges are Elohim, and there we go, we could take that to Psalm 82. Now, there's something going on in this passage under the hood, as I mentioned a few moments ago. A couple of things to look at more closely. If we look at the word God in the passage, we can see obviously that is indeed Elohim. If we look at the verb right next to it, condemns, there's something here that, again, for those who want to argue a plural translation here, that sort of drives them to do so, or at least gives them a good excuse. And that is the word condemns is morphologically plural. The little abbreviation here in my reverse interlinear tells us that this is a verb form and it's third masculine plural. The P is for plural. And so they would say, well, look, we have to translate Elohim here, gods, because subject-verb agreement. Okay, the noun is morphologically plural. Everybody knows that about Elohim. Most of the time it's used with a singular verb form, like in Psalm 82, the first occurrence. But here we have a plural, so we must translate it with a plural. So here the translation should say, the one whom the gods condemn shall pay double to his neighbor. And therefore we have to have Israelite judges. We can't have any other thing. Well, that's not actually a secure argument. It's not nearly as secure as the people who make it would like you to think. Because it assumes that plural verb forms with Elohim require a plural translation of Elohim. Now, I actually wrote on this subject, and you should be looking at that on your screen right now. Should Elohim with plural predication be translated gods? I wrote this for a journal called The Bible Translator in 2010. And in this article, I used some special databases, again, that Logos pioneered. Syntactic databases, we pioneered the development. It was developed by two scholars, Francis Anderson and Dean Forbes. And that allows us to search for this kind of thing, where we have a noun, but I want to know what the predicator of that noun is, and then you can apply morphology to it. So that's what I did. I found all the occurrences where Elohim, or ha-Elohim, Elohim with a definite article, goes with, in the sentence, in a clause, a plural verb form, a plural predicator, whether it be a finite verb or a participle. Because I wanted to see, okay, in these instances, do we have to translate it? Does it make any sense to translate it as a plural, gods? Just kind of a subject I was interested in. Now, there are 10 of these. There are 10 occurrences where you have Elohim or ha-Elohim with plural predication. You can see the list in front of you. Our passage, of course, is Exodus 22:8. Now, a few of these we can sort of just wipe off the table right off the bat because they're in the mouths of pagans or the mouths of Gentiles or the mouths of apostates. The references in 1 Kings, of course, coming from the mouth of Jeroboam and Jezebel. Again, we don't really care what they say about Elohim because they could be, hit or miss theologically. What we care about more is sort of what an Orthodox Israelite, a biblical writer, would do in the text, would do with the grammar. So do the biblical writers require us, through their use of grammar in these instances, okay, these less than 10 now instances of Elohim with plural predication, should we see that as a plural? Should we see Elohim as a plural and translate it accordingly in these passages? So these are the passages we want to focus on, or at least I'm just going to make a few comments about them and then go back to Exodus 22. Now, my findings in the article, and again, some of you may or may not have access to this article. Journal articles are often not publicly accessible. If you're part of my Divine Counsel bibliography, you will have access to this article because it's part of the collection. But in any event, every instance, this is sort of my conclusion in the article, every instance of Elohim or ha-Elohim plus plural predication, except for possibly, it's a maybe, Genesis 35:7, shows that Elohim could not only be translated singularly, God, capital G-O-D, but actually should be, because of something else in the context, something else going on in the grammar. Now, I want to take you to a few examples here where the grammatical context requires a singular translation, capital G-O-D, even though Elohim is lumped in, grouped with a plural predicator. 2 Samuel 7:23 is a really good example. Let's take a look at the passage. We read in verse 23, "And who is like your people Israel, the one nation on earth whom God went to redeem to be his people, making himself a name and doing for them great and awesome things by driving out before your people," so on and so forth, driving out the nations. Now, I have the verb went highlighted here. Its subject is God, Elohim, and the verb here is plural. Our little morphological codes show us that it's plural, and so should we translate this, "And who is like your people Israel, the one nation on earth whom the gods went to redeem," wait a minute, to be his people. You can see right away a plural translation doesn't make any contextual or theological sense, but there's actually a grammatical point to be made here. If you look carefully at the verse, we have whom, one nation on earth, whom God went, whom Elohim went, there's our plural verb. Elohim went to redeem, to be his people. We have a singular suffix, his people. That alone tells us, aside from the contextual incongruity of a plural translation here, that tells us that even though we have Elohim plus a plural verb form, we really have to translate this as singular G-O-D, because we have a singular suffix here. Not only one, but we actually have a second one. To redeem, to be his people, was our first one, making himself a name. Again, the same thing, a singular suffix, preposition plus suffix. So we have two indications that only one entity, only one entity is being referred to as the one who went to redeem his people. And even though the verb form is plural, and Elohim is plural, it still requires a singular translation because of the rest of the grammar. Now, this is what you would take back to Exodus 22. What the point is that there is no reason, grammatically, theologically, contextually, there is no reason to conclude, if you're just looking at Exodus 22:8, that Elohim there should be translated plural and that it points to human judges. It's just fine to translate it singularly. Just God, capital G-O-D. Translation of capital G-O-D works just fine. So Exodus 22:8 is no argument for, again, this idea that we have plural Elohim here and they must just be men. They must just be Israelite judges. It doesn't work. And so I want to take you through really, other passages that just, I think, make it absolutely clear that what we have in the council are spiritual entities that are real, that actually exist. Again, this is the biblical worldview. This is what your Bible says. Let's go to 1 Kings 22, and this was a passage that I brought up in our first lesson, the very first lesson in the series. So it might be a little familiar, I hope it is, but I'm going to read part of it, but let me just summarize it. Again, this is the passage where God has decreed that it's time for Ahab to die. And the two kings in the question, Ahab and Jehoshaphat, who are inquiring of prophets, should we go up to this battle? Again, we know God has decreed it's time for Ahab to die. And again, as a reader, we suspect, that, hey, Ahab's going to go die in this battle. That is what we think is going to happen. But they go back and forth with their prophets. And finally, the prophet of Yahweh is brought, out of prison. His name is Micaiah. And this is what Micaiah says when they ask him, should we do this? Micaiah says in verse 19, "Therefore hear the word of the Lord. I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, and all the host of heaven standing beside him on his right hand and on his left. And the Lord said, Who will entice Ahab, that he may go up and fall at Ramoth Gilead?" Again, that's this battle. So we have a divine council scene. God is sitting there on his throne. It's the throne room of God. The heavenly hosts are standing around him. Again, we know as the reader, we have this suspicion that, Ahab, it's time for Ahab to go. And now we get a glimpse behind the veil of what, God is doing to carry out this destiny, Ahab's destiny. And so what does God do? God says, okay, who among you, okay, the heavenly host here standing around, who will entice Ahab so that he goes up to this place, remote Gilead, and meets his doom? And now look at what the rest of the passage says. And one said one thing, and another said another. So there's this debate between the members of the heavenly host. Then a spirit came forward. Okay, these are not idols, folks. They are spirit beings. This is what the Hebrew text says. They are spirits. A spirit came forward and stood before the Lord, saying, I will entice him. And the Lord said to him, by what means? God gives him a little quiz. Again, God knows. He's not looking for information, but he's prodding him a little bit. And he said, I will go out and I'll be a lying spirit in the mouth of all his prophets. And again, paraphrasing, God says, yeah, that'll work. Go get it done. Go get it done. And of course, we know the rest of the story. This is actually what happens. It's actually what's been happening. Ahab's prophets have been lying to him, telling him to go up if everything's going to be wonderful. And Jehoshaphat, the king in the south, isn't quite sure. That's why he wanted Micaiah. He wanted to hear what Micaiah had to say. But as the story plays out, Ahab does indeed meet his doom at this battle. But our point here is that here we have a divine council meeting, and the members of the council, the members of the heavenly host with God, that God allows to participate in the decision. God has made a decree. He's made a decision. It's time for Ahab to die. But he allows the members of his council to decide how to get the job done. We know what God wants. Okay, we know it's time for Ahab to die, but how do we want to do that? And God allows them to participate, kind of like he allows us to participate in what he does in our terrestrial realm. So we have a meeting of real entities. Again, they're not idols. Let's go to Daniel 7. And this is a familiar passage because it's the Son of Man passage. Lots of Christians know this passage. But I think there's some details in here that people often miss. This is actually a divine council meeting in Daniel 7. We read in verse 9, again, Daniel narrating what he's seeing, what he's witnessing. He says, as I looked, thrones were placed. Notice thrones, plural, were placed. And the Ancient of Days took his seat. Again, we know who that is. That's God. His clothing was white as snow. The hair of his head was like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames. A stream of fire issued and came out from before him. 1,000,000 served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. Then what do we read? The court sat in judgment. Okay, the thrones, plural, back in verse 9, are not for God and the Son of Man. Remember when the Son of Man shows up in the scene? He doesn't take a seat. He comes to the Ancient of Days, and then he's given everlasting dominion and so on and so forth. Here we have, again, a group, a council, a court. The court is seated. The court sits to render judgment. It's a divine council meeting. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. And so now the fate of the four beasts in Daniel 7 is going to be determined. Let's go to Daniel 4. We have another sort of such instance like this. This is the account where a watcher, that is a holy one, an angelic being, divine being, sent from God, comes to Daniel, and he gives Daniel information about a dream Nebuchadnezzar had that is going to involve Nebuchadnezzar suffering temporary insanity. And of course, we know the story. Nebuchadnezzar eats grass. His fingernails grow like claws. Okay, we're not going to get into the details of the story specifically, but what I want you to see here, it begins in verse 13. I saw in the visions of my head, Daniel says, as I lay in bed, and behold, a watcher, a holy one, came down from heaven. Now, holy one is important because if you're going to say that the members of God's divine council are idols, when you get to Psalm 89, then you got to say the idols are holy ones because it's the council of the holy ones. Doesn't that sound ridiculous? It sounds ridiculous because it is. Okay, the gods of the council, the plural Elohim of the council, are not just idols. They are real spiritual entities. This is the biblical worldview, and this is what your Bible says. So a watcher, a holy one, comes and delivers the message. And we keep reading on. When we get to verse 16, we get into part of what's going to happen to Nebuchadnezzar. Let his mind be changed from a man's. Let a beast's mind be given to him. Let 7 periods of time pass over him. And then we read this in verse 17. This sentence is by the decree of the watchers. The decision by the word of the holy ones. Now, if you keep going, you see another detail in verse 24. This is the interpretation, O king. It is a decree of the Most High, which has come upon my lord the king. Not. Think about that. You just have had a decree issued by the watchers, the holy ones, and the Most High. That tells you that what's being pronounced on Nebuchadnezzar is from the divine council. Again, it's this participatory idea. God, again, is the Most High, but in some way that we're not specifically told, at least here. We were told back in 1 Kings 22 about how the members of the divine council participated, but here we're not given that specific. But since the decree is issued from both parties, the holy ones and the Most High, we can assume there's some participation there. But that means that this decree comes from God himself and from the holy ones. Now, do you realize how ridiculous it is, again, to say that the members of the divine council are just idols? Because then you have to say again that the idols are holy ones, and that God works with them. God does not work with idols. Idols are not holy ones. To say that the members of the divine council are not real, they're just idols, is absurd. It is textually and exegetically absurd. Now let's just summarize where we've been in this particular lesson. Again, just a few summary points. The God of Israel, we've seen, rules with the loyal members of his council. Again, he's not ruling with fallen beings, gods who are in rebellion, like the Satan figure and the watchers of Genesis 6, the sons of God, who are imprisoned. And it's none of that. The loyal divine beings who are loyal to the God of Israel, to their Creator, they get to participate with God in his council. Okay? So God rules with the loyal members of his council. These members are called holy ones in several passages. They are called spirits in 1 Kings 22. God makes decrees and allows his holy ones to participate in the carrying out of those decrees. And by definition, these cannot be idols. Idols are not holy ones. That's a contradiction. God does not work with idols, and therefore the council of the holy ones in Psalm 89 and the divine council of Psalm 82 is not a council of idols. The plural Elohim of Psalm 82 is not a description of idols. These are real spirit beings. They're spiritual beings, in this case, who are loyal to their Creator, loyal to the God of Israel. Now, why do people sort of bother with this myth? This myth about the members of the council are just idols. Well, again, it's because they resist the notion of divine plurality. And we're going to get to that in our next lesson. We're going to talk about how all of this meshes and is consistent with the uniqueness of the God of Israel, because there can be only one of him. We're going to talk about that next time. But a lot of people want to deny that the plural Elohim are real. And that effort really misunderstands Psalm 82, but it actually also misunderstands the whole conception, the whole rationale, the whole logic of ancient idolatry. See, people think that if they say the members of the divine council are just idols, then they get to say they're not real. Well, guess what, folks? Ancient people, ancient pagans, if we want to use that terminology, they didn't believe that their idols were real. They knew their idols were just pieces of wood and stone. They weren't idiots. They weren't morons. But what they believed about those idols was that they were just living space for real entities. And so what that amounts to is that saying they're idols doesn't accomplish anything. Because people in the ancient world would have said, yeah, well, we know that, but this is just a place where the real Elohim, the real God, lives. Okay, so you don't actually win anything there. You don't actually get to dismiss the reality. Again, it's a misunderstanding of the ancient world. Now, I want to quote to you from a couple sources about the logic of idolatry. Again, just to sort of reinforce the point. And specifically, I'm going to start off with Egypt. And I'm going to quote from this article by Gay Robbins, Cult Statues in Ancient Egypt. And it comes from the book Cult Image and Divine Representation in the Ancient Near East. It's an ASOR publication, the American Schools of Oriental Research. So this isn't Billy Bob's website. This isn't somebody just making it up. This is someone who does Egyptology. Gay Robbins is an Egyptologist. So in her essay about idols in Egypt, figures in Egypt, she writes this. In general, statues in ancient Egypt were places where a non-physical entity, a deity, the royal Ka spirit or the Ka spirits of the dead, take your pick, could manifest in this world. Statues provided physical bodies for these beings and allowed them to be the recipients of ritual actions. In order for a statue to function in this way, it had to undergo the opening of the mouth ritual, which vitalized it and enabled it to house the being it represented. Now, the logic is very similar in Mesopotamia. From the same book, different chapter, this one's by Michael B. Dick, called The Mesopotamian Cult Statue, A Sacramental Encounter with Divinity, Dick writes the following. The Mesopotamian cult statue is a special theophany or epiphany by which the deity's power and efficacy are made available to the iconodule, in other words, the worshiper. In fact, it is the main conduit of divine self-disclosure. I will try to illustrate this epiphanic bond using the Roman Catholic theology of the real presence, transubstantiation, in the Eucharist. The Eucharistic analogy helps us understand the theology of the ancient Near Eastern cult image. By the words of the Eucharistic prayer and the invocation of the Holy Spirit in Orthodox tradition, the bread and wine made by human hands become the real presence of Jesus. Now, Dick is drawing this analogy from Catholicism. Again, the idea of transubstantiation. He's only using it as an analogy. He's saying, look, it works the same way as your transubstantiation idea. So whether you believe that or not, let's think about the analogy. You have bread and wine made by people, but in transubstantiation, they become the actual presence of the deity, in this case, Jesus. So, in Mesopotamia, Dick this is what he does in his article. He's saying, so people in Mesopotamia knew they were making an idol. They know they're the fashioners of this object. But when they fashioned it, and then when they went through certain rituals, the real presence of a deity, they believed that this was a real being, came to inhabit the statue. It was a living space. It was a holding place. That was the logic of idolatry. Now he goes on, Dick in his article says this, in Babylon, offerings are brought before Marduk himself in the Esagila. It's a reference to the sacred space place, again, temple complex, and not before the statue of Marduk. So when offerings are brought, they're thinking that they're bringing them before Marduk himself because Marduk inhabits the statue, and not just the statue. The Era epic makes it clear that if a statue's appearance corrupts, let's say it gets dirty or damaged, then the deity can abandon his image. Era reassures Marduk that he shall rule in his stead during Marduk's absence while his statue is being restored. Era opened his mouth and spoke to Prince Marduk. Again, this is what the text says. Until you enter thy house, Prince Marduk, and Gira purifies your garment and you return to your place, till then I shall rule in your stead. So in this episode, this particular episode in Mesopotamian material, Marduk's statue had become tarnished and dirty and just, ugly. And so they thought, well, Marduk, he doesn't want to live here. But while Marduk's gone, because of what happened to his statue here, I'm the king. I'm going to rule in his place, and then when we get this fixed, then Marduk can come back. So again, there's this distinction between the idol, the placeholder, and the actual deity. Now, another source, also by Michael Dick, same author. This is a book-length source, just by him. Or actually, it's an edited volume by him, but he, again, is responsible for a lot of the content. And the book is called Born in Heaven, Made on Earth, The Making of the Cult Image in the Ancient Near East. Dick writes the following on pages 33 and 34. The Mesopotamians clearly maintained a distinction between the god and his or her statue. The destruction of a cult statue did not entail destruction of the deity. When the statue of Shamash at Sippar was destroyed, and there's a text reference, by Sudian raiders under Simbar Shippak, roughly 1000 BC, when that happened, worship of Shamash could still continue using a symbolic equivalent, a sun disk. Shamash was the sun god. So worship could continue using a sun disk until the reign of Nabu Apla Idina, which was 130, 140 years later. So here's the point. When this statue of this deity got destroyed, the Mesopotamians didn't sit around and think, oh, our God is dead. No, because they knew that the idol wasn't the deity itself. The idol was a placeholder. The idol was just a place of residence, place to live. And so, taking this back to our discussion for this particular lesson, it does you no good to assume in the Hebrew Bible or outside the Hebrew Bible that all of this God's talk, plural Elohim talk, oh, those are just idols and they're not real. No Israelite, no ancient person would have thought that, because they knew and understood the logic of idolatry. The reason these people do this is so that they can localize the deity. They can beckon a real deity that they believe exists. And of course, in biblical theology, they do exist, because the deities that the other nations worship, a la Deuteronomy 32, 8, and 9, once were loyal to Yahweh, but they became corrupt. He assigned them to the other nations, and they became corrupt. And that's what's going on in Psalm 82. God is judging them. So the Old Testament tells us why other nations worship other gods, where the pantheons essentially come from. They come from rebellious gods that God himself created and were once loyal to him. And frankly, if you think about it theologically, that's the way it has to be, because if any other being exists, if there's one other entity in the spiritual world, you can't say it created itself. You can't say it was always there. Okay? You can't say another deity made it, because by definition in biblical theology, there is only one eternal being. There is only one being that is responsible for everything else that exists in heaven or on earth, visible and invisible. And that is the God of the Bible. That is the God of Israel. So you are trapped in terms of the text, and in terms of theology, and in terms of logic. It's time to just surrender and say, I'm going to accept what the biblical text actually says. So now next time, we're going to continue in our series about the divine council, and we're going to ask this question. This is probably the question a lot of people have been waiting for. How does a council of Elohim, plural Elohim, how is that idea to be reconciled with the uniqueness of Yahweh, the God of Israel, the God of the Bible? And really the problem is not a theological one. The problem is a historical, cultural one. When we think of the letters G, O, and D, when we see them on a printed page, when we see them on a screen, our mind, because of the way we're trained as Westerners, and our Christian tradition, the way the Bible has been filtered to us through translation, when we see the letters G, O, and D, we just mentally assign a specific set of unique attributes to the letters G, O, and D. That's normal, and that's why it sort of creeps people out when you put an S on it, G-O-D-S. The biblical writers, though, did not think of the term Elohim the way we think of the letters G, O, and D. And how do we know that? Well, we know that because of the way biblical writers actually use Elohim. Elohim is used of a half dozen different things in the Hebrew Bible. So it's not a term that was used exclusively for the God of Israel. It's a term that's used of other lesser entities. And that alone should tell us that when a biblical writer used Elohim, when he wrote that word, he was not thinking of one specific unique set of attributes that sort of go along with that word. So the way we think of G-O-D is not the way biblical writers thought about Elohim. Let me give you some examples. In Psalm 82:1, we see Elohim, singular, the God of Israel. There's an instance of Elohim. We see plural Elohim, the gods of the divine council. And in verse 6 in Psalm 82, we know that they are referred to as the sons of the Most High, sort of a phrase that is a synonym for sons of God. So we have lesser entities, but they're still called Elohim. The gods of the nations, for instance, Chemosh, the god of Moab in 1 Kings 11:33, is referred to as Elohim. Again, an Israelite, an Orthodox Israelite at least, a biblical writer, would not think that the god of Moab is on the same level, either ontologically or in any other respect, with the God of Israel. In Deuteronomy 32:17, we have an occurrence of the term shadim. Now the shadim, which is a term that usually gets translated demons in our English translations, are referred to as Elohim in that verse. So Deuteronomy 32:17 classifies the shadim. It's actually a term that refers to a territorial spirit entity. But it classifies that term as Elohim. Again, obviously not the equivalent to the God of Israel, but nevertheless, there we go. The biblical term Elohim is used of the shadim. 1 Samuel 28:13 is probably my favorite example of this, where we have the story of Saul and the so-called witch. It's actually better understood as the medium of Endor. He goes to her and says, hey, the God of Israel isn't answering my prayers. He's not hearing me. I'm in trouble. I need to talk to Samuel. Well, there's one problem. Samuel's dead. So he goes to the medium and says, I want you to bring up for me Samuel. And in 1 Samuel 28:13, she does just that. We read in the text that she says to Saul, now she doesn't know who he is yet, hasn't dawned on her, but she says to him, I see Elohim coming up out of the ground. And we know that she's referring to one in particular because Saul in the story says, well, what does he look like? And the medium describes him. And Saul's like, that's him, that's him. Thank you. And then she gets freaked out because Saul had run all the mediums out of Israel. And she thought, well, now he's going to kill me. This was a trap. And he said, no, don't worry. I need to talk to Samuel. And so we have a conversation with the disembodied, dead Samuel. And we know it's Samuel because the content of the conversation are things that Samuel would have known, that we actually read earlier in the book of Samuel, that God gave particular information to Samuel. This is Samuel. It is the disembodied dead Samuel. But guess what? Samuel is referred to as Elohim. Now, no Israelite, whether they're really Orthodox or not, on this point, no Israelite is going to think thoughts like, my dear departed dead uncle, my dear departed mother or father, is on the same ontological attribute level as the God of Israel. They would never think that, but they're both called Elohim. Now, the last category it really derives from Genesis 35:7. There you have possibly an instance of Elohim referring to angels generically. I actually doubt that. I think the better explanation is that Elohim is used there to refer to an episode in the life of the patriarch, that if you go back and trace that episode, Elohim is there being used of the specific angel of Yahweh, who is linked to Yahweh himself by virtue of the term Ha-Elohim in Genesis 48, other passages. But nevertheless, you have 6 different things referred to as Elohim. Some of them, shadim, disembodied human dead, gods of the nations, the lesser Elohim of the council, the sons of God, are not at the same level that the God of Israel is. But nevertheless, we have the term Elohim used of that particular deity. Now, Yahweh is distinguished in biblical theology as, again, the creator, the sovereign, omnipotent, almighty, omniscient, all these things, but none of that comes along through, none of that is transmitted through the term Elohim. The way we learn that are other descriptions, other episodes in the Old Testament. None of that is really packed into the term Elohim. Elohim is used of a wide variety of things. So back to our question, what about monotheism? Well, what you really have going on in the biblical data, if we sort of collected all this, Elohim actually is a term you would use to describe an entity who is by nature disembodied, who lives in the spirit world. In other words, Elohim is a term you would use to sort of label something as to where it belongs, not what its attributes are, but where it belongs. This is why Elohim is used of all these different things. They all have one thing in common. They are disembodied spirit beings who inhabit the spirit world. That's all Elohim means. It's sort of like a term of location or address. Now, in that realm, Yahweh, of course, is part. Yahweh is an Elohim, but no other Elohim is Yahweh. That is what an Orthodox Israelite would have believed. That's what a biblical writer would have believed about the God of Israel. There's no attribute equivalence, but they all are Elohim because they all live in the spirit world. Now, monotheism is actually a late modern term. It was a term coined in the 17th century. At the time, its antonym, its opposite, was not polytheism, it was atheism. Atheism, no God. And then monotheism, well, there is a God, is sort of the way it was used. That modern term is kind of clunky when it comes to trying to use it to describe what we just talked about, the multiplied use, the plural use of Elohim. So we have a disconnect culturally and historically, but not theologically. While monotheism is kind of a clunky term to describe the biblical data, the spirit of the term monotheism is very much intact and consistent. Yahweh is species unique, and that again is what monotheism in modern times is sort of trying to convey, the uniqueness of the God of Israel. And the God of Israel is unique, not because he's called Elohim, but because of the way he's described in the Hebrew Bible that no other Elohim ever gets described.
We Christians say that we believe in an unseen God who spoke the universe into existence, rose again from the dead, and yet we tend to impose a naturalist view on what we read in the Bible. Specifically, want to talk about Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, which has been de-supernaturalized or de-mythologized over the centuries. And this can lead to some really different interpretations about what God was telling Moses about that, or what had been handed down to Moses through the histories that he was familiar with. For people who aren't familiar with the passages we're talking about, what do they describe, and what do most Bible scholars or commentators, how do they view the passage?
Yeah, there are lots of buckets for this one that you could throw it in. For those who aren't familiar with the passage, this is the old sons of God saw the daughters of men, took them wives of all they wanted to, and had children, because really odd offspring, the Nephilim, the men of renown, the giants. So this has been one of the more vexing passages for Old Testament scholars and just, Bible readers for a long time. And scholars, tend to throw it in a bunch of buckets. There are those who would just say, okay, this is what it says. We take it at face value, but it's pure mythology. It has no relationship at all to reality. The Christian scholar, though, predominantly, goes down a different road. They can't really say, well, here's something in the Bible that, is just a bunch of hokum. So they have to do something with it. And so the natural tendency is to demythologize it or strip it of its supernatural qualities.
Can I ask you really quickly
Sure.
to clarify, when you say mythology, I think most people assume mythology means it's made up.
In the academic sense, myth is, as an academic term, just, doing academic stuff, speaking academese now. Myth is a story in which some of the main characters are divine beings. They're not humans. So you could say, well, the Bible is full of mythic stuff. And it is, because God's like the center stage actor in so much of it. So you can use a term like mythic in that sense. And if you're in a room full of academics, well, they're going to kind of know what you mean. But if you're not, you start using words like mythic and mythological, they're going to just make it sound like, okay, you mean it's a cartoon.
Yeah.
Okay, that sort of thing. So there's a difference there, and it depends on the context and, you know, what the person's thinking and what you're hearing and all that. But because of that, Christian scholars have tended to, again, want to normalize the passage. They want to just make it, oh, well, it seems to suggest this, again, this divine human transgression thing, okay? And you will find those themes in other literature, you know, mythic literature or mythological literature, and they'll say, well, it can't be that. Okay, so it must be something else. And the something else is typically to take the sons of God and make them just normal people. And this is where the sons of Seth idea, so the dominant approach within evangelicalism is that what we have here are two lines. The godly line of Seth, those are the sons of God. And the women in the story are the sons of Cain, the line of Cain. Well, the text never actually says that, but if you make it two lines, then they're both human, and oh, well, that's the end of that problem. Of course, then you have to do something with the offspring. And so this is where we get the tendency to look at a term like Nephilim and kind of disregard the fact that every ancient translator, whether it was the Greeks producing the Septuagint in between the Testaments, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, or later on, you know, when the Old Testament is put into Aramaic, all of those, you know, traditions, at least the Greek traditions, would use gigantes, giant. And a lot of the Targums, again, are not fudging this either. A lot of the Aramaic translations, they're kind of uneven. Some do, some don't. But when you're talking about the Septuagint, which was the Bible of the early church, which was the Bible most of the time that the New Testament quotes when the apostles or Jesus quote the Old Testament, they're using the Septuagint. That's gigantes. Okay, that's giants. And so you have to ask yourself the question, well, why did they look at this word and think that thought, as opposed to, again, modern evangelicals will look at that word and say, oh, it means fallen ones, like warriors fallen in battle. Well, the answer is because that helps you to normalize it. It helps you to take all the characters in the story and just make them normal people. There's nothing odd going on here, nothing supernatural going on here. You know, just keep walking, citizen. There's nothing to see here. It's just one of those things, you know, but there's this impulse, and I'm not saying it's sinister. I am saying it's incorrect for some really fundamental reasons, but it's not sinister because people who do this tend to think, well, I need to do this to protect the Bible, you know, against this mythological charge. So they do it.
That's an interesting viewpoint. Okay, God is incapable of making the Bible clear and consistent, so I'm going to help him out.
Yeah, or the supernatural might scare people, so let's not make it too supernatural. You know, and what's so normal about the virgin birth? Okay, to use your opening, you know, we're Christians. We affirm the fact that there's a God. You know, you're Trinitarian, which means you have to affirm the incarnation, the virgin birth, what's so normal about that stuff? And when you really think about it, there's nothing normal about that stuff.
Right. Well, a friend of ours, Guy Malone, made a really interesting observation once. He said, look, the price of admission to this club that we call Christians is believing that a Jewish carpenter literally rose from the dead, and it's supposed to make more sense from there?
Yep. God passes through the birth canal. You know, I mean, this is what you're saying, and Christians, well, of course we're saying that because that's important. That's what we believe. But a passage like Genesis 6, you know, the first 4 verses becomes peripheral, since it's not tied into, or at least people think, anything else. And it's tied into a lot, actually. But even if you know that, well, there's no major doctrinal point here being made. So we can strip the supernatural out of this one, and we're okay. And then it goes back to this, well, we kind of need to do this because then the Bible, you know, starts to have a relationship religiously to some other ideas. Well, it's like, hey, newsflash, people in the ancient world were not like us. They were not predisposed to not believe in the supernatural. Okay, they were predisposed to believe the supernatural. And if you as a Christian believe there's a God who actually interacts with people, did and does, then it's not so much of a leap. What about the cohabitation? And if you take the literal cohabitation view, well, it just says that divine beings could take upon themselves human flesh, and flesh does what it does. They don't have to eat, but they do that. They wrestle with people. They don't have to take bodies. They could just show up visually, but they don't. So again, they're very simple ideas that when you really think about them, it's like, well, yeah, that we would expect a divine being, a God, to be able to do something. And this doesn't seem like such a tall order as opposed to like creation. So what's the problem? And again, the problem is going back to this whole, I think, confusion of mythic and mythology and all that, because unbelievers love to throw rocks at the Bible for things like that.
Yeah, you believe in floating axe heads and talking donkeys and giants who walked the earth back in the day.
I just wanted to just stay on this just for a second. Since the original language doesn't mention the Cain line and the Seth line, how did that get started?
Well, it gets started because of the assumption that Genesis 6, 1 through 4 is sort of building off Genesis 5, where you get genealogies, and other genealogies where you do have a line of Seth and a line of Cain in different biblical genealogies in different passages. And so I hate to put it this way, but this is kind of the scholarly truth here. Hey, we don't really know what to do with the first 4 verses. So they're about like intermarriage, so that must be genealogy talk. So we take it back to that. Again, that becomes the justification, even though none of the wording is like the standard genealogies. No. You don't have any of that. You don't have the line of Cain specifically mentioned. And why is it that all the line of Cain are the bad guys? And why are they all women? I mean, you start asking questions like this, but to me, even that's peripheral. I think the real issue is, why didn't Peter and Jude take your view?
Good one.
Pastor. Why didn't they take your view? Because they don't.
Well, let's explore that. Where do Peter and Jude draw their material from? Because it seems to me that there's some things that they draw upon, talking about the angels who were punished for not keeping their first estate. That is outside the Bible. But I guess the bigger question is,
it's out and in.
Yeah. and why did they do it? What was so important about interpreting these first 4 passages literally and taking and incorporating that in the biblical narrative, the intermarriage, the interbreeding of angels and humans?
Yeah, I mean, Peter and Jude both draw on this episode in their talk about false teachers. And there's a reason for that, because associated with this event in intertestamental Jewish literature comes with it the idea of false teaching, that the watchers, again, to use the intertestamental, the Enochian language for the sons of God, were teaching things that, were opposed to the truth that God wanted humans to have. And so there's a natural connection in the mind of the New Testament writer between, to use Peter's phrase, the angels that sinned and false teaching. So they become a convenient analogy to address false teaching. But back to the question about, well, what about these other sources? I mean, there are a couple of very clear indications that Peter telegraphs what he's thinking about, and Jude the same way, angels that sinned. Okay, angels who are kept in gloomy darkness in chains. Okay, these phrases. In the Greek text, one of the passages has basically sent to Tartarus. Okay, went to Hades, the chains of gloomy darkness. The Greek verb there was tartarao, which actually meant something to a Greek. It doesn't really mean anything to us because we don't translate it that way. But this tells you that they're thinking about not only something that their Old Testament, our Old Testament records this event, because there is no other angelic sin in the Old Testament. There just isn't. People say, well, what about the third of the angels, being swept down before creation? And guess what? There's no passage in the Bible that says that. The closest you get is Revelation 12.
Which post-dates
Right.
Peter and Jude.
And it's associated with the first coming of Jesus. Now the last time I checked history, that was after the creation.
Yes.
Yeah.
So there is no other candidate for this angelic sin. So Peter and Jude are just telling you point blank, this is what they're there's only one thing that they can be thinking of. In between the Testaments, though, you get a lot of Jewish writing interpretation of Genesis 6, 1 through 4. Now, I'm working on another book presently about what was the original context for Genesis 6:1 through 4, and that takes you back to Mesopotamia, and that material was known to the Jewish writers in between the Testaments, which is where they get it from. So they're actually drawing on elements of an original thing that the writer of Genesis was shooting at. They're aware of what that thing was. And that kind of leaks into their own writing. And by doing that, they preserve it. And then they use it in the New Testament, because the whole idea of being imprisoned in darkness, you don't get that in Genesis 6, back in the Hebrew Bible.
Right.
You do get it in intertestamental period. And in the original story, the Mesopotamian story that Genesis is shooting at, you get it there too. Now you get hints of it in passages like Ezekiel 32, where you have the Rephaim, again, the vestiges, the descendants of the Nephilim through the Anakim are in Sheol, they're in the underworld. So you get hints of it there. But you don't get a verse that says, oh, and by the way, after this event, God was angry and he sent them to Sheol. You don't get a verse that says that, but you get them present in that place later on. So this extra tradition we think of as intertestamental, that doesn't count because it's not biblical. Well, it's actually very consistent with things you do get in the Old Testament in other passages about these descendants winding up in this place. It's actually very consistent across the board.
I guess just to bring this home with just about 5 minutes left here, the understanding the ancient Jewish understanding or concept of the Nephilim, Anakim, Rephaim, why is a supernatural understanding of that story necessary for Christians? How does that impact the concepts of sin and salvation?
That's an excellent question. On one level, we've talked about one element, and that is, look, if you want to be able to say Peter and Jude were correct, in other words, I don't have to correct them, okay, then you're going to go with what they say. So that's a fundamental issue for bibliology. But beyond that, we're trained as Christians to think one way about kind of our circumstances, and sin you brought up very directly relates to this, whereas an ancient person thought a little bit differently about it. Here's what I mean. If you walked up to the average Christian today and said, hey, why is the world the way it is? Why do we have human depravity? What happened? If the creation story, everybody was kind of had a relationship with God and it just went terribly wrong so fast. How did that happen? Well, the average Christian would say, oh, that's the fall. It's Genesis 3. Okay, a Second Temple Jew, again, living in Jesus' time, would not say that. A Second Temple Jew would say, well, there's basically three reasons. There's not just one, there's three. One is the fall. The other, when we know that sin enters the world there, we have the first rebellion, humans rebel, the divine rebellion, that's where it all gets started. But then we have Genesis 6:1 through 4. And because of what happened there, remember Genesis 6:5, the wickedness of man was great on the earth. Well, there's a whole set of ideas, again, in the period of Jesus' day, that blames the watchers, blames the sons of God who violated God's boundary rule here between heaven and earth, and taught humanity all sorts of things that corrupted them. So a first century Jew would be thinking, that's part of why the world is as bad as it is, because of what happened there. Because we had another divine rebellion, and it made us even more wicked. They manipulated us. And then the third is the Babel event. This is going back to this concept of cosmic geography, when God punishes the nations by assigning them to the sons of God, and the other sons of God become corrupt. So a first century Jew would say, we're just messed up, not just for one reason, but for all three of these things. And what the church has done is the church has defaced, really eviscerated Genesis 6. So that is out of the picture. And you never really learn about Deuteronomy 32, 8, and 9 when it comes to Babel. You just learn the story. But the supernatural element to that is taken away too.
Right.
So the big answer is there's three events in the Old Testament that amount to divine acts of rebellion and human acts of rebellion, and the fallout, pardon the pun, of all three are why humanity is just in such a mess. And when the Messiah comes, here's why it's a big part of this that's really missed. they believed that when the Messiah would come, he would reverse all these things, not just Genesis 3. Okay, Jesus is, of course, the answer to the problem of death. Okay, Genesis 3, okay, resurrection. But he's also the answer to the infection of humanity by evil, by these other divine rebellions. And there are things in the Gospels, in the book of Acts, in the epistles, that draw on this idea of messianic reversal of these other two things too, that we never get to in our theology. So if you want to have a fuller understanding of who you are, what the mess you're in is, and what Jesus was about, you need this other stuff. Now that we've had a brief overview introducing the divine counsel, the whole concept there, I want to take you into the divine counsel worldview. Again, this is basically just another term for biblical theology. Subtitle here, Cosmic Geography and Salvation's Plan in Biblical Theology. The divine counsel, which is really God's rule through his heavenly host, or his non-human imagers, has a direct intersection with his human imagers, life on earth. Again, the biblical story, as it were, is really about the restoration of God's rule on earth through his imagers, whether they be human or non-human, to restore Eden, to reenact, restore, whatever word you want to use, his original plan to live with his human creations, those who are like him, who image him, along with his invisible family, his spiritual family, his non-human divine family, to have us all as one family on earth, administering, stewarding the creation, which was at the beginning just a little slice of creation, just a little part of the globe, but God wanted, through his promise and his covenant, his command, his mandate to Adam and Eve, to make the rest of the world like Eden, where he lived and they lived with him. And so that post-fall is where biblical theology moves, how to restore that. And so the divine counsel, the unseen realm, is an inextricable part of what's happening with us. And it's often neglected. I remember in Bible college and seminary, angelology got 2 days attention. It's something that's totally peripheral, which is a huge mistake in biblical theology. So we're going to just take a look at the overarching worldview that emerges from this, and I think you'll see pretty clearly how all-encompassing this sort of thing is. So we'll begin in Deuteronomy 32, 8, and 9. And again, this is the sort of thing I'm going to be presuming as I go through passages on a weekly basis to teach you. But Deuteronomy 32, 8, and 9 is sort of a fundamental passage. If you read it, we have here, when the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. But the Lord's portion is his people. Jacob is his allotted heritage. Jacob, of course, being another word for Israel. Jacob is Israel. So what do we have here? When did the Most High divide up the nations? When did he allot humankind to specific nations and fix their borders? Well, that's obviously a reference to the Tower of Babel. Now, this is the ESV. And this phrase here, according to the number of the sons of God, does not appear in many other translations. Same thing with verse 43, same chapter, Deuteronomy 32, where we read, "Rejoice with him, O heavens," could be translated, "O heavenly ones. Bow down to him, all gods." In other words, these gods right here, and these gods right here, there's a relationship here. These gods, the sons of God, that God allotted to the nations. Notice when he divides up the nations, he fixes their borders. He divides them up according to the number of the sons of God. We're going to be looking at some other passages. Essentially, this is the Old Testament rationale for why we have other gods. where the other pantheons came from of the Gentile nations, the nations who were not the Lord's portion, the nations who were not Israel. This is the Old Testament world after Babel. Nations divided up, assigned to other gods, and in Deuteronomy 4:19 and 20 we see that the gods were assigned to them. But these gods were supposed to be obedient. They were supposed to be obedient to the God of Israel, to Yahweh, the one who did all this, the one who was superior and supreme. I'm going to click out to Deuteronomy 32 here. And just so I can show you the footnotes here, ESV version again, we have here number 2. Compare Dead Sea Scrolls, Septuagint. Okay, that's where this reading comes from, the number of the sons of God. That is directly from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it's reflected in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. The Masoretic text, though, the text that most English translations are based on, reads sons of Israel. Get that up again, sons of Israel. Now, it doesn't make any sense. If we're talking about the Babel event, when God divides up the nations, dividing them up according to the number of the sons of Israel, not only is that a textually inferior reading, again, the sons of God is the reading that comes from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Sons of Israel does not. It's much later. It's in the Masoretic text. But not only is it an inferior textual reading, and you can read all about it. I did a journal article for Dallas Seminary's Journal on the text critical issues in this verse. But it's also illogical. Israel didn't exist at the time of Babel. Israel is not listed in the table of nations connected with the Babel event. It makes no sense to number something according to the number of the sons of Israel because Israel didn't exist in biblical history at that point. So it's obviously a sort of covert reading. It's something that was put into the text at a later time for various reasons, and scholars have different theories about this. And again, this is not news to anyone in the academic community who does Old Testament studies. It's a very well-known verse, very well-known textual issue here. But just on a purely logical level with biblical history and biblical theology, it makes no sense to say sons of Israel because there was no Israel. So let's go back here and take a look at what we're talking about. Again, at the Babel event, we have in Genesis 11, the prior chapter, Genesis 10, is the so-called Table of Nations. We get a list of the nations of the known world at the time to the biblical writer. If you count these up, the number is either going to be 70 in the Masoretic text or 72 in the Septuagint, and it's based upon whether two of the terms are put together or divided. But either way, it's a reference. Either number 70 or 72 is a reference back to the Babel event and this listing. It's a number that's going to come up later in the New Testament when Jesus sends out his disciples. That's going to be interesting. I don't know if we'll get to that in our little talk here, but it's part of the cosmic geography of the Old Testament. But these nations right here are the ones that get divided up. These are the ones that the biblical writers know. Israel, of course, is Yahweh's own portion. All the other nations are assigned to lesser Elohim, assigned to the sons of God. They are allotted to the sons of God, put under their authority so that those gods govern those nations now. This is a punishment in the wake of Babel. I actually refer to this event in Deuteronomy 32:8-9 as the Romans 1 event of the Old Testament. You know, Romans 1 talks about how God gave people up to their own sins, and they get what they deserve, and you know what they wanted, God gave them and said, well, you know, it's going to cost you, this is going to destroy you, you know, you're going to be a slave to sin and all this stuff. Well, this is what's going on here in the Old Testament. What you have here is God giving up the nations. Up until the time of Babel, he had been working with humanity. He'd taken them out of the flood. He reiterated the covenant to Noah and said, now go disperse over the earth. Of course, they don't do that. They want to call God down at Babel. That's the tower, the quote-unquote tower they're building. Pretty much all Old Testament scholars believe that's a ziggurat in a Mesopotamian context. And it's a temple complex. It's part of a temple complex. It's where you call God to you. And God says, no, this isn't what I said. I said go and disperse the nations, because the whole program here is about spreading my good rule over the whole earth, restoring Eden, making the globe Edenic, being my people and doing this in obedience to me. But they don't. They rebel. And so consequently God says, fine, if you don't want to listen to me, I'm going to put you under the authority of other gods, other lesser Elohim that report to me, and you're going to have to deal with them. Now, I want them to administer justice and all this sort of stuff. Psalm 82, which we looked at in the last video, is God looking at the gods of the council and saying, you have corrupted judgment. If you read the whole psalm, that's what it's about. God is taking the Elohim of his counsel to task. At the end of the psalmist says, rise up, O God, and reclaim the nations. Take the nations. Take the nations back. This is the logic behind, as we'll see in the New Testament, we eventually get into the New Testament era, the nations have to be reclaimed, and they're reclaimed with the gospel. Acts 2 is going to factor into this picture. We'll get there in a moment. None of this is accidental or coincidental. But the Old Testament view of what's going on is that at Babel, God said, Yahweh, the God of Israel, said, enough of this. I'm abandoning you. I'm disinheriting you. I'm putting you under the authority of other gods. And you know what I'm going to do now? I'm going to create my own people. Jacob is my portion. Israel is my portion. That's why in the very next chapter of Genesis, chapter 12, what does God do? Right after Babel, he calls Abraham. And he makes a covenant with Abraham and says, I'm going to take you, and it's going to be through you that I'm going to raise up my own family, my own seed. Yeah. The new Eden, the new Edenic program here, run through Israel. And so the rest of the Old Testament is the story of Israel against the nations, Yahweh against the other gods, because the other gods eventually are going to rebel, and they're going to seduce Israel to worship them instead of Yahweh. Now, this picture, again, the disinheritance of the nations, the call of Abraham in the next chapter, it's actually reflected in the New Testament in a number of places. We're just going to go to one. Look at what Paul says here in his sermon at the Areopagus. He says, the God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place. Okay, this is hearkening back to Babel. Why? Why did he do that? Well, he disinherits them, puts them under the other gods, but the whole purpose, because he calls Abraham right after he punishes the nations and assigns them to other gods. He calls Abraham. Remember what God said to Abraham? Through you, all nations of the earth will be blessed. Why does he do that? Verse 27, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him. Yet he is actually not far from each one of us. This is part of Paul's message. The reclaiming of the nations that were disinherited back at Babel and put under the authority of other gods who become hostile to Israel and seduce the Israelites, Yahweh's people, away from him. And again, this is the Old Testament story. Israel against the nations, Yahweh against their gods. Let's look at a couple other passages. Deuteronomy 4:19 and 20. This is the parallel passage to Deuteronomy 32:8 and 9. Moses, again, is part of one of Moses' sermons. He says, beware, lest you raise your eyes to the heaven when you see the sun and the moon and the stars and all the host of heaven, that you be drawn away and bow down to them and serve them, things that the Lord your God has allotted to all the peoples under the whole heaven. So right here, we have it again. This idea that the heavenly host, again, the divine beings that are, in the spiritual realm here, God has allotted them to these other nations. Okay? But the Lord has taken you, Israel, and brought you out of the iron furnace, out of Egypt, to be a people of his own inheritance. Remember back in Deuteronomy 32:8, 9, Israel is Yahweh's portion, as you are this day. Let's take a look at another one. You got host of heaven language here. Back in Deuteronomy 32:8, it was sons of God. Keep those phrases in mind. Host of heaven, sons of God. We get up to Deuteronomy 17, and we read this. If there is found among you within any of your towns that the Lord your God is giving you, a man or woman who does what is evil in the sight of the Lord your God in transgressing his covenant, and has gone and served other gods and worshipped them, or the sun or the moon or any of the host of heaven, which I have forbidden. So here we are in chapter 17 now, tracking through Deuteronomy. These same gods that were allotted to the nations, the God of Israel says to his own people, Israel, you must not worship them. Okay, you must not worship them. I am the Lord your God. The Shema, Deuteronomy 6. The Lord our God is one. Okay, the Lord our God. Okay, the Lord our God is one. And we can talk about what one means. Again, it has interesting divine council connections, because ultimately the nations were supposed to be drawn back to the one God. Israel was the conduit through which that would happen. But again, those are subjects for another time. I'm trying to just give you a rough overview. Deuteronomy 29. Let's go there. We have here, if Israel, again, does evil, worships these other gods, and gets overthrown like Sodom and Gomorrah, all the nations will say, why has the Lord done this thus to his land? What caused the heat of his anger? And then the people will say, it is because they abandoned the covenant of the Lord, the God of their fathers, which he made with them and when he brought them out of the land of Egypt. What'd they do? Well, they went and served other gods and worshipped them. Which gods? Gods whom they had not known and whom he had not allotted to them. See, he allotted the other nations to other gods. Deuteronomy 32, 8, and 9. But Israel was Yahweh's portion alone. He took them for himself, because he created them right after he disinherited the nations in Genesis 11 at Babel. Then he called Abraham and began his own people again, disinheriting everybody else. But he didn't forget them, because when he made the covenant with Abraham, he said, look, those who bless you I will bless, those who curse you I will curse, and in you, or through you, all nations of the earth will be blessed. He didn't forget them, but he did disinherit them for a time. Deuteronomy 32, 8, and 9, we saw that these were the other gods allotted to the nations, and the nations allotted to them, two sides of the same coin. Well, what happened? How's the story end? Here we are. Doesn't end well. They, the Israelites, sacrificed to demons, not God. We saw this verse in our earlier video about the divine council. They sacrificed to gods they had not known. Again, this is committing evil. This is what God warned them through Moses not to do in Deuteronomy 17. It was why he is going to punish them, the warning that was given in Deuteronomy 29. Here it happens in Deuteronomy 32. These are the gods, again, back in verses 8 and 9 of Deuteronomy 32, that were allotted to the other nations. Israel fails. Israel sins. They were supposed to, if you remember verse 43, the way it was supposed to work was that the other gods were supposed to bow down to Yahweh, but they did not. They seduced the Israelites. They became hostile to what God was trying to do. And Psalm 82, which we saw in the previous video about the divine council, is God saying, you know what? You're going to be punished. You're corrupt. You didn't obey. You're going to die like men. Okay, you're going to die like a human does. I'm going to remove your immortality. Now, we know from other passages and other places in the Old Testament that vision of that happening is eschatological. It comes future to the Old Testament. What we're going to see here in a moment is that the beginning of the undoing of the grip of the gods on the nations happens when Jesus shows up, and especially when he dies and rises again, and the gospel, at the Pentecost event, penetrates the nations, permeates the nations with the message about Jesus, of the Messiah. And that is the beginning of the advance of the kingdom of God and the diminishing, the undermining of all these other kingdoms, all these other controls that the gods have over the nations. Back into the Old Testament, though, this whole idea, again, that an Israelite, a biblical writer, looked at the world in such a way that Israel, the land promised to Abraham and his descendants,
was holy ground. Okay, this is where Yahweh was to be worshipped. Yahweh owned this land. It's not that Yahweh doesn't own the earth. There's plenty of other passages like that. But there's this territorial sense that the nations around Israel are governed. They're under the authority of hostile gods, hostile divine entities. Now, God says, I'm going to deal with them. But for the time being, those gods are, in the mind of the biblical writer, real, and they're a threat, and they're serious. They are not to be worshipped. Okay, they are to be avoided. And so when you were not in Israel, when you were not in holy ground, you were somewhere else. You were in the domain of another. That, yes, the God of Israel had assigned that turf to one of these other divine beings. So we know, who's superior. But it's still a scary thing. It's still a threat. You're still on territory that was not promised to you by covenant with your God, with the God of Israel. This helps to explain a number of different passages. Let's go to 1 Samuel 26. When David, again, is fleeing from Saul, he winds up, in different parts of that whole episode, that whole fiasco, running from Saul and whatnot. In this particular passage, 1 Samuel 26, David, again, has come upon Saul and has spared his life. And look at what he says. When he's going back and forth with Saul, he says, "Now therefore let my lord the king hear the words of his servant. If it is the Lord who has stirred you up against me, may he accept an offering. But if it is man, may he be cursed before the Lord. For they have driven me out this day, that I should have no share in the heritage, the inheritance of the Lord, saying, go serve other gods." Again, is David denying the omnipresence of God? No. What he's saying is, look, I'm no longer in Israel. You're chasing me all over the place. And there are times I get driven out beyond the boundaries of Yahweh's land, the land promised to us. And the people who are doing that say, go somewhere else and have another god, worship other gods. Again, it's this sort of consciousness that Israel is holy ground. Any other ground is not. Okay, it's under the dominion of another entity. 2 Kings 5:17. I won't click there, I'll just summarize this. This is one of my favorite stories. It's the story of Naaman the leper with Elisha. Remember, Naaman, he's from Syria. He's a captain, important military guy, works with the king there. But Syria is a foreign land, under foreign dominion, foreign gods. The god Ramon, in fact, as we learn in the passage. He has leprosy, and one of his little servant girls, who's a captive Israelite, says, hey, why don't you go over to Israel and Elisha will heal you? I mean, we know this story. And so he does. He gets some of his men, he goes over there, and Elisha won't even meet with him. He says, through an intermediary, well, just go wash in the Jordan 7 times and you'll be clean. And Naaman gets mad, because it's like the Jordan, this little trickle. I mean, we have better rivers, where I come from. And he gets into an argument, and his servants, his men, say, look, if the prophet had told you to do some great thing, then you would have done it. Why don't you just go do it, see what happens? And so Naaman does, and sure enough, he's cured of his leprosy. He comes back, and he says to Elisha, now I know that Yahweh is the God of gods. I know now. And so do we remember the story? We remember that much. That's what gets told in church and Sunday school, but it misses a detail. What does Naaman ask for from Elisha when he goes back? He asks Elisha, would it be okay if I fill up some bags of dirt? I want to take dirt back with me as much as my mules can carry. I want to take dirt with me because when I go back home, I'm an important guy, and I have to go into the temple of Ramon with the king, and the king's kind of old, and he leans on me, and we're not really told if Naaman has to sort of go through the motions with the king there, but he's got to take the king there and take care of him. It's part of his job. So he says to Elisha, would it be okay if I take dirt back with me? Now that only makes sense in terms of cosmic geography, because what he wanted was he identified the ground of Israel as holy, as belonging to Yahweh. So we're not told exactly what he would do with it. Maybe he took a little with him. Maybe he sprinkled some on the ground when he had to go on the territory of Rimmon, the foreign god. Maybe he'll carry a little bit with him in his pockets or whatever. He wants dirt because he wants to be on holy ground. Because his faith is now in Yahweh, the God of Israel, not Rimmon. Now he knows who is God. Again, it's a great passage that's only decipherable in the context of cosmic geography that originates with what happened at Babel. Daniel 10 is the same thing. We have the Prince of Persia, the Prince of Greece. These are divine beings, at least that much. It doesn't rule out that they're working with human authorities, but at the very least, we've got, again, divine authorities over these nations, because we learn that Michael is in charge of Israel. He has been given the caretaking of Israel. And we notice that in Daniel chapter 12, verse 1, too. It's cosmic geography. Again, it's just the same old thing. And again, these aren't the only passages that get into this, but I think they're good illustrations. Now let's go to the New Testament. How does this factor into the New Testament? Well, it factors in a big way in the book of Acts, and specifically at Pentecost. Now, we all know this story, but you don't really know the story. If we look in Acts 2, when the day of Pentecost arrived, they were all together in one place. And suddenly there came from heaven a sound like a mighty rushing wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting, and divided tongues as of fire, so on and so forth. Now, I've clicked on the word divided for a reason here. The Greek lemma is diamorizo. If we searched for that Greek lemma in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, guess where it shows up? Deuteronomy 32, verse 8. Okay, the whole thing about when the Most High divided up. Right here we have it. Hote, when diamorizen, third masculine singular form. Ha hupsistos, when the Most High divided up ethne, the nations. Right there it is. Acts 2 is using this vocabulary drawn from Deuteronomy 32. Well, why would they do that? Why would Luke do that? Well, let's just keep looking here. Keep going in Acts chapter 2, verse 5. Now there were dwelling in Jerusalem Jews, devout men from every nation under heaven. And at this sound the multitude came together, and they were bewildered. You know, when all this freaky stuff starts happening in Acts chapter 2, they're bewildered. Well, what's going on? Because each one was hearing them speak in his own language. Well, this time I've clicked on the word bewildered for a reason. The lemma, Greek lemma, is sunkeo. If we look this one up in the Septuagint, Greek translation of the Old Testament, guess where this one shows up? Genesis 11. What's Genesis 11? The Tower of Babel incident, when the nations were divided. Okay, what Luke is doing is he's putting little toeholds, little links, little bridges from the day of Pentecost back to the dividing of the nations in Genesis 11 and Deuteronomy 32. He wants his readers to mentally go back to that event, because that event is the precursor, it is the backdrop, it is the framework for what happens in Acts chapter 2. Now, Acts chapter 2, we read about what happens. The Spirit comes upon the followers of Jesus. They're enabled to speak in all these other languages. Who's there at Pentecost? Well, it's Jews from where? From all over the known world. All the nations. All the nations have some Jews living in them. It's like cell groups. You know, God has providentially used the disaster of the exile and the diaspora, all this stuff, to plant his people in these nations that he knows he will reclaim. And they're living there. And when it comes time for Pentecost, lots of them are going to come back to Jerusalem. And on this particular occasion, they come back to Jerusalem, and it's after the resurrection of this guy, Jesus of Nazareth, and they hear the message of Peter. and they see what happens in Acts chapter 2, the mighty rushing wind, the divided, the cloven tongues, the divided tongues, everybody's been enabled to speak the gospel in all these different languages. This is infiltration. This is divine infiltration of the nations with the gospel. And the crazy thing is, if you read through Acts chapter 2, and you look at those nations, again, the ones in red here are the ones that are actually mentioned. The list, just watch this. The list starts over here in the east. This is the farthest penetration of the Jews during and after the exile. This is Mesopotamia. Okay, this is part of the Persian Empire. This is where Esther, winds up and all this sort of stuff, the Medes and the Persians. There are still Jews living here after the return from exile. So Acts chapter 2 tracks through, from the east, all the places where the Jews are living among the nations and starts moving west. Okay, and when it hits the Mediterranean, it heads north and south, the list. Right here and here, it's moving west till finally in Acts chapter 2, we hit Italy. But all this turf, okay, was ground that was known, nations that were known back in Genesis 10, back at the Babel event. It is a subtle sign to the intelligent reader that what's happening at Pentecost is divine infiltration and the beginning of taking every nation back through the Messiah, through Jesus. Look at the way Acts unfolds. Acts 2 is Pentecost. The story takes up, after Pentecost in Jerusalem, then it expands to Judea, Acts chapter 2 through 8. You get to Acts 8, and look at the places, look at the geography where things happen in Acts. Samaria. What's Samaria? Well, Samaria was the apostate northern kingdom of Israel in the Old Testament. Samaria is part of the Acts story. Why? Because God wants you to know that I'm taking that back too. It's not just the nations, it's everything. Ethiopia, the Ethiopian eunuch, the last Jew. Why is Ethiopia associated with Jews? Because historically, it is. There were Jews who fled here in ancient times, fled the onslaught of Nebuchadnezzar, and even earlier. We know that there were significant Jewish colonies in Egypt and other parts of Africa, down into Ethiopia, Cush, and Cush, of course, is mentioned in the Table of Nations. So Cush doesn't get mentioned back here in Acts 2, but it gets picked off the list right here in Acts chapter 8. Lo and behold. Then what happens in Acts chapter 9? Paul's converted. Who's Paul? Paul is the apostle to who? To the Gentiles, to the nations. Jerusalem, Judea, and here we go. Everybody else. Paul is going to track through as many of these places, these nations, as he can. Okay, Acts chapter 9, in conjunction with the conversion of Paul, we have Damascus mentioned. Well, what's Damascus? Damascus is the northernmost point at which Abraham set foot back in Genesis 14. It is encompassed within the promises given to Abraham for the land. Remember when God said, hey, look, everywhere is, wherever your foot treads, that's what I'm going to give this land to you? When Abraham goes and chases the kings who kidnapped Lot back in Genesis 14, this is where he stops. Again, it's telegraphing a message. Everything that belongs to me, I am taking. And it all belongs to me, but it's systematic. To someone who knew their Old Testament, this isn't going to be missed. Cornelius, the first Gentile convert, the program is underway here. Missionary journeys, Acts 11 to 19, under Paul. What's he doing? Paul is driven by the concept, he reads in passages like Isaiah 66, of reclaiming the nations. It's called in the New Testament the fullness of the Gentiles. I have people in every nation. I'm going to get them. I am going to slowly reclaim all the nations, all the people in those nations that are mine. The kingdom of God is going to overspread them. And eventually, at the end of days, the day of the Lord, everybody's going to turn to Jerusalem. Everybody's going to turn to worship Yahweh again. It will be what it should have been back in Eden. This is all an intelligent plan, and it's intelligently and deliberately telegraphed, if you have eyes to see it, in the book of Acts and lots of other places. One really cool thing is Paul is driven to get to Spain for some reason. Rome and Spain. If you go back to the map, in Acts 2, the westernmost point is Italy. It's Rome. Okay? So he says in Acts 20, remember the account when Paul goes back to Jerusalem after his missionary journeys, and he had been told in Acts 20, let me see if I have this here. Yes, I do. Acts 20, verse 22, Paul says, "Now behold, I'm going to Jerusalem, constrained by the Spirit." I mean, the Spirit's just you got to get back there, not knowing what will happen to me, except that the Holy Spirit testifies to me in every city that imprisonment and afflictions await me. Paul says, look, I got to get back to Jerusalem. I'm done with my work here. I know bad stuff's going to happen to me because the Spirit tells me that. In Acts 21, when he gets there, he seeks out disciples, stays there 7 days. Through the Spirit, they were telling Paul not to go on to Jerusalem. So now he's in Judea, and he's a little closer. They say, look, Paul, don't go to Jerusalem. Don't go, something bad's going to happen. And it even says elsewhere in the passage that the Spirit was telling them too, when Paul goes to Jerusalem, something bad's going to happen. He's going to get arrested. Something's going to happen. While we were staying for many days, a prophet named Agabus came down from Judea. Coming to us, he took Paul's belt, bound his own feet and hands, and says, "Thus says the Holy Spirit, this is how the Jews of Jerusalem will bind the man who owns this belt and deliver him to the hand of the Gentiles." Even a prophet empowered by the Spirit says, "Paul, if you go down there, you're going to be arrested. You're going to be taken. You're going to be captured." Well, Paul knows this. This is not news to him. Look at what he said earlier in Acts 19. This is prior to Acts 20, when Paul makes up his mind to go to Jerusalem. Look at what he says. Paul resolved in the Spirit to pass through Macedonia and Achaia and to go to Jerusalem. So as Paul is winding up his work, he's already got Jerusalem on his mind. And look at what he says. He says, after I've been there, I must also see Rome. Paul fully expected to get to Rome. Now, he doesn't know that his arrest in Jerusalem is going to be the means by which he gets to Rome. But he knows he needs to go to Rome. Why? Because he has to keep moving west to get back the Gentile nations that were listed in Genesis 10. We haven't been to the westernmost part yet, a place called Tarshish. If you remember, let's go back. I don't want to give you a headache here, but let's go back. Right here. See, here's Italy. Here's where Rome is. There's a spot mentioned here back in the Table of Nations that we haven't hit yet. Right here. Tarshish. It's an outlier. Paul says, got to get to Jerusalem, and I'm going to go to Rome too. And when he writes to the Romans, he gets arrested in 54. He's under Roman imprisonment. When he writes Romans, he's writing to them saying, hey, I'm going to see you guys. I'm on my way. I'm on trial. I'm going to go appeal to Caesar. I'm going to get to see you guys. Look at what he writes. Thus I make it my ambition to preach the gospel, not where Christ has already been named, lest I build on someone else's foundation. But now, since I no longer have any room for work in these regions, these places where I've done my business, I'm done there. Since I have longed for many years to come to you, Roman believers, I hope to see you in passing as I go to Spain. And when therefore I have completed this and have delivered to them what has been collected, I'll leave for Spain by way of you. Why does Paul believe he's going to get to Spain? Why does Paul want to go there so bad? Why? Again, here's where Acts is going to end up. The journey back to Rome. Here's where he needs to go. Guess what? Guess where Tarshish is? Spain. This is why Paul wants to get there. Paul, in his mind, is living out, let's go back here, he is living out the fulfillment of passages like Isaiah 66, where God said, I'm going to reclaim the nations. Paul is fully conscious of the Old Testament worldview that all these other places are under dominion. And the gospel needs to get to all of them to reclaim them for the God of Israel, who is incarnate in the Christ that he preaches. Paul is in serious trouble. He could end up with a death sentence. Eventually he does get one. But he is determined, I'm going to get to Rome, and it's going to work out, because I'm going to visit you guys in passing on my way to Spain, because I got to get there, because it's the last place on the list. And he's moving west. It's an intelligent plan. He knows what he's doing. He is fully cognizant of the Old Testament worldview. Look at his vocabulary for the powers of darkness. Now, Paul does use the word demons. You know, we have Deuteronomy 32:8. But when the Most High divided the nations, divides them up under the number of the sons of God, and those sons of God become corrupt, and they seduce Israel. Deuteronomy 32:17, a few verses after the division of the nations is talked about. In Deuteronomy 32, it says that the Israelites worshipped demons and not God, gods they had not known, the gods that had not been allotted to them. Paul does talk about demons, and the word there in Deuteronomy 32 is shadim, comes from shadu. It is a guardian entity. Why is that language used? Because the other gods guard their turf. They own it. Okay, they were given it, and they consider it their domain. That's why you have this language. And look at what Paul does. When Paul uses the word demons, he uses it in 1 Corinthians 10, where he's quoting Deuteronomy 32. It's not an accident. But the other vocabulary he uses, rulers, principalities, powers, or authorities, the exousia, powers, dunamis, dominions, lords, thrones, world rulers, except for dunamis, which I think occurs once. All of these other terms are terms of geographical rulership. Again, this is not an accident. Now, what's really cool about this, get it in your head. In the Old Testament worldview, God, the real God, Yahweh, the unique Yahweh, the one who is an Elohim, but no other Elohim is him. The one who chooses to surrender these nations, chooses to disinherit them, to throw them, give them what they want, punish them, put them under the authority of other gods, and then he takes Israel as his own in Deuteronomy 4, Deuteronomy 32. And the rest of the story is Israel against the nations, the gods against Yahweh. That's your Old Testament. And then we see what happens in Acts about this great reversal. Well, where does it end? Because we, as humans, back in Eden, in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, and of course the garden scene, we were supposed to be part of this. Well, guess what? We are going to be part of it, and Revelation says that. And a lot of other passages that I have to skip for time. The whole concept in the New Testament of divine sonship includes ruling and reigning with Christ. Look at some of these passages in light of the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. Revelation 2, Jesus is speaking. Look at what he says. Nevertheless, hold fast to what you have until I come. And the one who conquers and who keeps my works until the end, I will give him authority over the nations. Now catch this. And he, this one that overcomes, this believer, this hypothetical believer, he will shepherd them with an iron rod and will break them in pieces like jars made of clay. Do you realize where this comes from, the iron rod? That comes from a messianic psalm. Jesus, who is the Messiah, is describing believers like Messiah, shepherding with an iron rod, authority over the nations. And then he continues, and also I have also received from my Father this authority, and I will give him, the believer, I'll give him the morning star. Well, what's that? Well, the morning star language in Revelation 2:28 is messianic as well. It refers to a divine being. Divine beings were referred to as stars. Job 38:7, the sons of God are called the stars of God, and other passages. But this one here, the morning star language associated with the Messiah, okay, with Jesus, Jesus is the speaker, harkens back to Numbers 24:17. The star language associated with the Messiah. A star will go out from Jacob, and a scepter will rise from Israel. Notice that the star doesn't rise over Jacob. Jacob isn't territory. Jacob is Israel. But this passage is not quoted in the birth story of Jesus by the Magi. That is not what it refers to. This is not about the Star of Bethlehem, where it identifies the place where Messiah is born. This says a star will go out from Jacob. It refers to a person who will come from Israel and have a scepter. Scepter will rise from Israel. It refers to a person, it refers to the Messiah. Later in the book of Revelation, we have morning star language again. Jesus refers to his messianic standing in the same language. I am the root and the descendant of David. I am the bright morning star. Well, he just said in Revelation 2 that he will give the morning star to believers. And he quoted Psalm 2 about believers ruling with a rod of iron the way Messiah does, the way Messiah is supposed to. Do you realize what's happening here? Jesus himself is connecting us, believers, with him and with his right to reign. Who? The nations who were disinherited. Revelation 3. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, indeed I will come into him and dine with him, and he with me. We know that part. We know that part. We got nice pictures of it. Of course, we skip verse 21, which is very unfortunate. The one who conquers. I will grant to him to sit down with me on my throne, as I also have conquered and sat down with my Father on his throne. We're not going to be floating on clouds, playing harps, and having a jam session around the throne of God. That is not what heaven is. Heaven is dominion over a global Eden. We rule it, we enjoy it as was originally intended, and there is no more threat of evil.